New Orleans Saints wide receivers Michael Thomas, Jarvis Landry, and Chris Olave completely changed the game week one for the Saints. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering the New Orleans Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much, as always, for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget that we're free and available on all podcast apps and on YouTube as well. And I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter, your New Orleans Saints expert credential member of the media, CrescentCitySports.com, USA Today's Saints Wire, Tuesdays on Locked On NFL, and here with you every single Monday through Friday on Locked On Saints. And today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends over at Prize Picks, daily fantasy the way it should be. All you have to do is pick 2 to 5 players, whether or not they're going to come in at more or less than their Prize Picks projections. And if you get those right, you can win up to 10 times your entry. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match of up to $100 by simply using the promo code Locked On. That's prizepicks.com, promo code Locked On. On today's episode, we are going to go through and continue to break down and look a little bit more, kind of a deeper dive, if you will, into the New Orleans Saints' big comeback victory against the Atlanta Falcons. We'll take a look at trench play, the ups and downs there. We'll take a look at how the New Orleans Saints made up for the loss of Gardner-Johnson in the slot, where they didn't really seem to see any type of a drop of production there. And we'll also take a look at starting off here with the wide receivers that helped the New Orleans Saints take a massive step forward and really change the game in New Orleans, or in Atlanta, for the New Orleans Saints. Before we get into these wide receiver numbers, which are honestly pretty impressive and a big time change of pace for the New Orleans Saints, I want to talk about something else that's massively impressive. And it's the stat that was put out by CBS Sports. It's how bad the Atlanta Falcons are when they lead in the fourth quarter. Over the course of the last 3 years, non-Atlanta Falcons teams are 242, 2-1. That means 242 times they won, 2 times they tied, and 1 time they lost when they go into the fourth quarter, winning by 15 or more points. That's a 98.7% win percentage. The Atlanta Falcons, however, going into the fourth quarter with a 15-point lead or more in the last 3 years, are 5-3. That's just over like 65, 67%. Not great, Bob. Not great in Atlanta. So I thought that was really interesting. That's the kind of stuff we're going to dive into here when we get into these sort of Analytics Tuesdays, is breaking down things in terms of the deeper look at the numbers. And so that's where I want to start today. But over on the wide receiver side, the New Orleans Saints put a lot of focus on the wide receiver group over the course of this offseason. Of course, the return of Michael Thomas headlines all of it, but they also added veteran free agent Jarvis Landry over the offseason, and then also rookie in their NFL draft, Chris Olave, right at the top of their draft. So one of the things that I want to highlight is, of course, the big 40-yard catch that was down the left sideline between Jarvis Landry and Jameis Winston. Now, Jameis Winston let that ball go, and it traveled about 53.8 or so yards through the air when he let that one go. But by the time that it made it to Jarvis Landry had a 0.6 yard target separation on that. So just over half a yard of separation from the nearest defender. Casey Hayward was off looking somewhere else. But Jarvis Landry was able to come down with that catch. And you remember a couple of things that we highlighted about where the New Orleans Saints are going to get better at wide receiver is, 1, the idea of, route running, of course, 2, separation. And even when they don't get separation, 0.3 was always the contested catch factor. And Jarvis Landry was one of the top players there in terms of the guys that were coming in as a New Orleans Saint this year. So he's able to go up and make that catch despite having a 19.6% completion probability rating in that one, the lowest of any pass thrown in week 1 of the 2022 NFL season. So there's a big time difference maker for you. And that was Jarvis Landry not playing the role that a lot of people kind of expected from him here in 2022. He wasn't just close to the line of scrimmage. He was pushing downfield. He ran 4 outs that ended up with 3 catches for 32 yards, the majority of those going beyond 5 yards. He had one pivot route that went out to the outside. That was a nice catch by him. He had one slant, which came in, around, less than 10 yards. Dig, the big 9 route that completed the 40-yard pass, and then a corner route that was incomplete when targeted. But he pushed to all 3 levels throughout this game. And that was something that maybe we kind of tried to highlight a little bit during training camp, but you can only see so much, right? Like, just because they're turning these players into 3-level attacks in training camp doesn't mean that it's going to translate out onto the regular season. And it absolutely did here for Jarvis Landry. And I would say something similarly when it comes to Michael Thomas. Michael Thomas ran 2 slants in this game, both of which led to incomplete passes. The rest of what he did was basically pushing downfield, with the exception of the 2 fade routes, which he caught for touchdowns, 8 yards, 12 yards, all of that. I mean, you can only go as far as the goal line will let you in that situation. But he also had 2 posts, one of which was caught for 20 yards. And then he had one sort of fade. I don't really know how to describe it, but he started from the slot and then kind of spray release to the outside and then pushed upfield a little bit. That one was also caught for over 20 yards coming out of the slot. And then he had a pivot route as well. So again, 3 levels of attack. That's not something that we saw a lot from the New Orleans Saints last year. Everyone kind of had a defined role in a way. And these 3 players have defined roles in terms of what their specializations are, but they can also do multiple things. Even Chris Olave here, 1 corner route run, 2 comebacks, and then 1 out. And then he had the really impressive route that Pete Carmichael took from his collegiate days and then moved over to the NFL. And then they ran for the 2-point conversion, which was their first 2-point conversion, successful 2-point conversion attempt in like forever, right? So you can just see where, like, just the attack all around the field, the way that this team was able to utilize these wide receivers and how these wide receivers ended up impacting and changing the game for the New Orleans Saints. It doesn't stop at just the routes that they ran. They also had pretty good separation. Michael Thomas, only 1.5 yards of separation. But again, his game is that if he's got half a yard, if he's got half a step on somebody, he's open. So by all accounts, he was, getting open in that one. Jarvis Landry, 2.4 yards of separation. Pretty good. The average across the NFL was 2.91 during week 1. Chris Olave, 3.8 yards of separation on all of his targets. And that's, topped the New Orleans Saints wide receivers and tight ends. And again, well beyond that 2.91 yards of separation average across the NFL. Finally, these wide receivers helped Jameis Winston to a 11.8% above completion percentage pass. So basically every quarterback will come in with these, advanced analytics sites, and they'll have an expected completion percentage that's based upon previous production, the wide receivers, what talent they have around them, all of that. And Jameis Winston's was around like 57%, and he ended up well above that by 11.8%. So it was the second highest above completion percentage in the NFL, just behind Josh Allen. He also had the second highest average of completed air yards per throw at 8.8, just behind one other player at 8.9. And then he also had the highest aggressive throw percentage as well. So if you were concerned about Pete Carmichael and Dennis Allen not taking risks, they took a lot of risks. Now, a lot of this also had to do with game situation, right? You have to be aggressive. You have to take aggressive throws. You have to take what's available to you when you're down 16 points and you're trying to come back, with 12 and a half, 13 minutes left in the fourth quarter. So some of that is dictated by the game situation, but nonetheless, it just goes to show you that Pete Carmichael, Dennis Allen, they're comfortable with taking risks with Jameis Winston, and also shows a lot of trust in Jameis Winston, and shows that Jameis has a lot of trust in his wide receivers. And it's hard to not trust these wide receivers when they're putting up numbers like we just broke down for the New Orleans Saints offense. Coming up next, wide receiver wasn't the only place to see a big change. Slot cornerback was a place that the New Orleans Saints saw a big change this offseason as well, with the trading away of CJ Gardner-Johnson. Justin Evans, though, stepped up and helped that transition be a little bit painless, at least for week 1. We're going to break down who all took snaps in the slot, what the production was, and how Pete Werner made a game-changing play from that same position. We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. But before we get to that, I want to tell you about our friends over at Prize Picks. Daily fantasy made easy, and in my opinion, the way that it should be. You're not going up against some computer somewhere or somebody that's been spending way too much time with their spreadsheets. You're not having to manage a salary cap. We don't like salary caps here in New Orleans anyway. This is daily fantasy. That's a lot of fun. And it goes for the NFL, NBA, MLB, golf, WNBA. Everything is absolutely covered over at prizepicks.com. All you have to do is pick 2 to 5 players in order to start your entry. And then you choose whether or not they're going to come in at more or less than their prize picks projections. Once you do that, if you clean up that whole slate of 5 players and you get everything right, then all of a sudden you could win up to 10 times your entry. All you have to do is head over to prizepicks.com today. And actually, first-time users will end up getting a 100% instant deposit match of up to $100 by using the promo code Locked On. So that means that you put down $100, PrizePicks will match you $100. You put down $50, PrizePicks will match you $50. Nice and simple. Don't forget to use that promo code Locked On, LOCKEDON, at sign up for that instant deposit match of up to $100 at prizepicks.com. Our next partner has a product that I use literally every day. I started taking AG1 by Athletic Greens because I'm somebody that struggles to take care of myself. I'm going to be honest. I work a lot. I push myself. I do all these things that are probably like really unhealthy habits. So the least that I could do is make sure that I have the vitamins, the minerals, the things that I need to take care of myself as best as I can throughout the day and give myself what Athletic Greens calls that daily nutritional insurance, which I absolutely love. I mean, there's this whole new science now around like gut health and all these other things and the way that it impacts literally everything about your day. Feeling sluggish, having pains, having trouble with digestion, all kind of centers back to gut health in a way is what we're learning. So one of the things that I love about AG1 is that the person that created it was kind of on this like heavy pill regimen and all that was costing him nearly $100 a day. And so he just kind of made this as a way to get all 75 of the high quality vitamins, minerals, whole food source superfoods, all the stuff that you need, including like adaptogens and probiotics, all in one scoop in 8 ounces of water every morning right before your cup of coffee. It's super awesome. And it's helped me kind of get a little bit better at taking care of myself. So I highly recommend checking out AG1 by Athletic Greens. And to make that easy, Athletic Greens is going to give you a free 1-year supply of their immune supporting vitamin D and 5 free travel packs as well with your first purchase. All that you have to do is head over to athleticgreens.com/NFL network. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/NFL network to take ownership of your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Thanks again for making us your first listen of the day every day, covering all of your New Orleans Saints biggest stories in under 30 minutes here on the Locked On Saints podcast. Today, or really over the course of the past couple of weeks, one of the biggest stories around the New Orleans Saints was the trade of Gardner-Johnson, sending him for like a 5th round pick for next year and then like a 6th round pick for the following year. To the Philadelphia Eagles. They also threw in a conditional 7th round pick because I guess the Philadelphia Eagles just wanted to show him who's boss, whatever. Like, oh, and throw in a 7th round pick. Like, really? But the New Orleans Saints traded him away. And one of the biggest sort of question marks that came up around all of this is outside of like why, which we've covered and we've talked about, like CJ wanted safety money. The New Orleans Saints aren't going to give you safety money if you aren't playing safety. They clearly had no interest in him playing safety because there were 2 open spots for him to play that position. And what do? They went out and signed Marcus May. They went out and signed Tyrann Mathieu instead. So for the New Orleans Saints, they saw him as a nickel cornerback, and he was a very good nickel cornerback, depending upon matchups and things like that. And so a lot of Saints fans were kind of curious about, okay, that maybe explains a little bit about why the trade happens, but now what are the Saints going to do in the slot? And one of the things that Dennis Allen had said over the course of, getting closer and closer to week 1 was that they would kind of switch this around depending upon game plan, matchups, all of that. So what did the New Orleans Saints do week 1? Well, they more than survived there. They actually played extremely well in the slot. And it kind of makes you wonder, like, how much of it is the individual player versus how much of it is the scheme putting people in position to succeed. And I do think that it has to be a little bit of both. And that's one of the reasons why I think this story in particular is so remarkable, is that they really just used Justin Evans for the most part in the slot. Now, it was a lot, more in depth than that, and we're going to break it all down because that's what Analytics Tuesday is all about. But Justin Evans took 68% of the slot snaps in week 1. That was 15 that he played in passing coverage, 10 that he played in the run game, a total of 25 snaps that he took in the slot. And just to make sure that everybody's on the same page, the slot is basically like the inside receiver. So if you have 2 wide receivers over on one side, That inside receiver is usually known as a slot. You have a nickel cornerback, which would mean the fifth cornerback on the field that ends up playing that role. The Saints love to utilize safeties in that role. They like bigger builds, bigger bodies, so that you can ask them to do a little bit more. For instance, there were a couple of plays where Justin Evans blitzed, right? So there's a couple different ways to deploy someone from that position. But in coverage was really the thing that everybody was kind of hanging on to, hanging on by, a string really when it came to, how the Saints were going to produce here. Justin Evans played extremely well. 5 targets, only allowed 1 catch for 5 yards. And that was a pass that was actually behind the line of scrimmage, 7 yards after catch. So he was just off the line of scrimmage a little bit and was able to make the play. So only allowed 5 yards, 1 pass breakup, and then had 39, and then allowed only a 39.6 passer rating when targeted in the slot. That's really good play by Justin Evans. And the Saints used a lot of 3 linebacker sets in this one. A lot of that is dictated by what the offense rolls out. So hearing that he only played 25 snaps in the slot, that's not too bad, right? I mean, that's in terms of what he was able to produce there. I mean, he was targeted quite a bit. I mean, he only played 15 pass coverage snaps from the slot and was targeted 5 times. It's a third of the time, but then only allowed 1 catch on those 15 passing reps on those 5 targets. And beyond that, he only allowed 0.33 yards, so a third of a yard per snap coming out of the slot. So he did extremely, extremely well there, covered very well, was very active, good tackler, sound tackling, all of that. So Justin Evans, everything that we saw from him over the course of training camp turned out to be true. And he proved it right away here in week 1, at least for week 1. We'll see. I mean, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are going to be without Chris Godwin, it looks like, going into next weekend's game, but Russell Gage will probably still take snaps in the slot. The Saints have struggled against Russell Gage in the slot before. He's a very good slot receiver. There's also still Scotty Miller. There's some really talented players in Tampa. So really next week will be the barometer for Justin Evans or whoever they deploy in the slot. And that brings me to my next point is who are the other players that played in the slot? Surprisingly, PJ Williams, which was kind of everyone's assumption would be getting the most snaps in the slot in this game, only had 2 snaps week 1 in at nickel corner. He had allowed 1 catch on 1 target for 8 yards, not a bad day at all. But the other players to see the most snaps at nickel or in the slot were Demario Davis. Again, a lot of this is matchup dictated, right? So the offense kind of dictates some of this, and I'll explain how that happens here in just a second. But Demario Davis had 6 slot coverage snaps, allowed 1 catch for 10 yards on 3 targets, not a bad day at all. Tyrann Mathieu, 6 coverage snaps in the slot as well. 1 catch on 2 targets for only 1 yard, played excellent there. Marcus May, 3 coverage snaps, not targeted. And then Pete Werner, 5 coverage snaps, 2 targets, 2 catches allowed, and 31 yards allowed, 5 yards after the catch. So he was a sound tackler right after. Now, if I left it at there, you would be warranted in assuming Pete Werner didn't have a great day from the slot. But let me explain to you why that's not the case and how Pete Werner kind of helped to change the game early, or at least keep things manageable despite giving up that number. The large portion of that play was this big kind of 22-yard catch that was allowed to Olamide Zaccheaus, who came out of the slot there. But this is sort of how oftentimes opposing offenses can dictate who gets that coverage snap, right? It's not just about, oh, Justin Evans is in the slot, therefore he guards the guy that's coming out of the slot. It's not always that simple, especially when you're playing zone coverage. And that's what happened on this play. It looks like it was a cover 4-ish look, if I'm understanding it correctly. And so Zaccheaus lines up far on the outside, offensive left, defensive right. So he's in coverage of Marshawn Lattimore. Before the snap, he starts his motion behind the line of scrimmage. The ball is then snapped before he completely crosses the formation. So therefore, he basically ends up taking the snap from like the tight end spot that you would see on the hip of the right tackle. That means because you have 4 defensive backs that are dropping back into coverage, it becomes the primary responsibility of the linebacker to carry Zaccheaus out of the slot. Pete Werner does so. Zaccheaus releases from the slot, pushes toward the outside to the right sideline, and then ends up cutting inside for a dig. In the midst of that long developing route, which we'll talk about the New Orleans Saints trenches here in just a moment, but in the midst of that long developing route, Drake London is coming from the far outside wide right and is clearing out the middle of the field, carrying both Marcus May and Tyrann Mathieu up the middle of the field. So that means that if you can envision sort of the middle of the field here, with Pete Werner being taken out of the middle of the field by Zaccheaus, and with Drake London pulling the safeties up deep from the middle of the field, middle of the field's basically wide open because Demario Davis has responsibilities elsewhere in his own zone underneath and to the right side, defensive right side of the field. So that means that with that big open cavity in the middle of the field, Zaccheaus is free to finish up his route, which is basically turned into a dig, and he pushes back inside to the middle of the field. Marcus Mariota is able to hit Zaccheaus over the middle because Pete Werner loses about a step in the midst of that. However, at the catch point, as we just mentioned, only 5 yards allowed after the catch when it comes to Pete Werner. So yeah, he might have given up some catches, but he continues to make those tackles at the catch point. Werner not only makes the tackle, but he strips the ball loose. That's the fumble that he caused earlier on in the game. So it was a 22-yard completion, but he also got the ball back to his offense and took the ball away. So with that being the case, it's not as bad a day for Pete Werner as it might have sounded just by looking at the raw numbers. This is why you take analytics and you take film and you mash them together and see what you get. So game-changing play there by Pete Werner, one that helped to keep things manageable. That big 22-yard catch could have been, a big start of momentum for the Atlanta Falcons in that one. And he was able to take the ball away despite the fact that he effectively got beat on the route that was being run that pushed him toward the outside, cut back inside. Really, really good stuff from Pete Werner there, and really, really good stuff by the New Orleans Saints defense, making up for their big personnel loss in the slot. Coming up next, long developing routes like that mean only one thing. The New Orleans Saints did not get enough pressure on Marcus Mariota. We'll break it down as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked on Saints. Before we get to that, I'm going to tell you about our friends over at BetOnline, your number one source for all pro and college football betting needs and sports info this season. The New Orleans Saints open up as home underdogs against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That might be something you want to get in on. You'd also take a look at season-long props. Maybe you feel really good about both Michael Thomas and Jameis Winston as comeback player of the year candidates after their week 1 performances. Couldn't say that I blame you there, but if you feel really good about it, you might as well go and make some money off of it over at BetOnline today. You'll find all of your football league developments, game matchups, news, podcasts, including all of the week 2 games and all the opening lines that are already there for you as well. BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and more. You'll want to check them out today over at BetOnline, where the game starts. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked on Saints with a look at the trenches for the week 1 matchup between the New Orleans Saints and the Atlanta Falcons. And the fact of the matter is that on both sides of the trenches, there were ups and downs. A little bit more concerning are the downs than are kind of encouraging the ups, if that makes sense. So let's break it all down. And I want to start over on the defensive side because, as we were just discussing, that big, long developing route was something that wasn't, unfortunately, the New Orleans Saints were not a stranger to on Sunday. They saw that pretty often. And a lot of that happened because the New Orleans Saints weren't really able to get pressure on Marcus Mariota. But what if I told you it wasn't entirely their fault, or that wasn't necessarily a part of the design either? Remember, Marcus Mariota is a mobile quarterback. So a lot of what the New Orleans Saints defensive line is doing is just trying to keep him contained. Now, the issue is that they didn't necessarily do that. Over 70 rushing yards for Marcus Mariota. The rushing yards, the rush defense, that's really my biggest concern when it comes to the trenches. But they did only pressure Marcus Mariota on 4 of 37 dropbacks. That's a 10.8% pressure percentage. But again, because they were so focused on containing and not over pursuing Marcus Mariota, which could have led to even bigger runs, more runs, all of that, we excuse it for right now. But really, next weekend will be a barometer, or this coming weekend will be a barometer. Or let me not say that we excuse it. There's just a world in which it all makes sense this way. The barometer in terms of their pass rush is Sunday up against Tampa Bay Buccaneers, where you have to get pressure with your front 4, dedicate a lot of coverage, and you have to get that pressure very quickly because Tom Brady gets the ball out. So that's going to be a little bit more of a barometer for the New Orleans Saints pass rush. The bigger concern for me was the run game. Cordero Patterson, 120 rushing yards, 1 touchdown, 22 carries, 5.6 yards per carry, ended up going through either side of the A gaps. That's right up the middle and either side of the center. That was on 9 different carries. 6.5 yards per carry ended up being around the tackles on the outside. That was on 6 carries. So whether he was running right up the middle or whether he was running around the edge, the New Orleans Saints had trouble containing Cordarrelle Patterson. And this is a team that's usually, hanging its hat on what it can do as a run-stopping defense. So that's my biggest concern for the New Orleans Saints defensive line going into week 2, coming out of week 1. The reason why the New Orleans Saints struggled in terms of those A-gap runs right up the middle is that on 7 of those 9 runs, the Atlanta Falcons absolutely won at the line of scrimmage and generated the push, moving the line of scrimmage 1, 2, 3 yards in some cases for Cordarrelle Patterson to basically advance the ball 1, 2, 3 yards without even being contacted and without even crossing the new line of scrimmage, which effectively gets reset by that offensive line in the run game. There were 2 plays where the New Orleans Saints did not allow themselves to get pushed back. The first one, Christian Ringo ends up just ragdolling the center, but misses the tackle, and then it turns into a 12-yard run. Yes, the NFL game is that fickle. And on the second one, Marcus Davenport and Caden Ellis, with 1:52 seconds left in the game, end up getting a 1-yard stop on Cordarrelle Patterson. And that's kind of a place where you're just trying to run the clock out if you're the Atlanta Falcons. Maybe you're not pushing as hard, whatever that might be. So just something to keep in mind there, because Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they're going to want to run the ball a lot on Sunday. And as they watch this tape against the Atlanta Falcons, they will see where it is are the weak points, and that they should be able to win on the offensive line, depending upon, or they'll feel confident winning on the line of scrimmage. But it will be about who makes the biggest leap, who makes the biggest improvement going from week 1 to week 2. That's always the story of these week 2 games. Looking over at the trenches on the offensive side for the New Orleans Saints, pressure. 30% of Jameis Winston's 40 dropbacks were pressured, although he was blitzed 35% of the time. However, when he was blitzed, they only gave up 1 pressure and 1 sack in those situations. That was on 14 of those 40 snaps. He was sacked 4 times all told throughout this game. Again, only once when blitzed. They only ran 4 play action dropbacks. He was 0 of 2 on those attempts, and then 2 screens, which went 2 of 2, but for -6 yards. So these kind of blitz beaters, these pressure beaters weren't working for the New Orleans Saints offense. Something to go back to the drawing board on there and look to figure out how you can improve. Play action, screens, all that stuff, always been a staple point of the New Orleans Saints offense. Now that you have a guy like Jameis Winston, you should be able to do that. A lot of 7-step dropbacks as well, which just creates a lot of time that you need in order for all of those routes to develop, because that means you're looking further downfield. Again, Pete Carmichael, Dennis Allen were not afraid to be aggressive in this game. Even early, they were still taking those 7-step drops and looking to see what was developing downfield. In terms of pressure allowed by player, 1 sack, 1 of the 4 sacks is not credited. That usually happens when it's an unblocked player, or if it's something about, if it's credited to Jameis Winston for holding the ball for too long, things like that. So there's 3 sacks that are credited, 1 to Alvin Kamara, who's credited with 3 pressures allowed, the most on the team. 1 credited to Cesar Ruiz, who's credited with 2 pressures allowed, and then the same stats there, 1 sack, 2 pressures allowed by Andrus Peat. Each Ryan Ramczyk, Eric McCoy, and James Hurst were all credited by Pro Football Focus with allowing 1 pressure. James Hurst, the only one out of those 3 to allow a hit in those situations. In terms of the run scheme, to wrap this up, because this is where we're going to go tomorrow. Can the New Orleans Saints get Alvin Kamara going next week? Because they'll need to. And now they have a bigger challenge with the linebackers at the second level on that Tampa Bay defense in terms of getting it started. But some hopeful things if you watch the week 1 game against the between the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Dallas Cowboys. Alvin Kamara in this game, 32 of his 39 rushing yards were after contact. So we were talking about the push that the Atlanta Falcons were getting in the run game. Not the same thing for the New Orleans Saints in their run game. 35 of his 39 rushing yards were all to the left side. James Hurst, Andrus Peat over to that side. Only 2% of his snaps, not just carries, not just runs, but of his snaps as a whole, were met with 8+ players in the box. It was actually only 1 snap. And it was on the 2-point conversion where there were 9 players in the box for that 2-point conversion. Something to keep an eye out on there, because this is another way, going back to the first point of today's episode, that the New Orleans Saints wide receivers change the game. This is good news for the New Orleans Saints. This is good news for you as a New Orleans Saints fan. Alvin Kamara is going to see lighter boxes this season. Next week, if he sees that against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, though, the New Orleans Saints have to get that going. We'll talk about how to do that in tomorrow's episode. I appreciate you so much, as always, for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day. Every day for your second listen, make sure you go and check out the Peacock and Williamson NFL show. All the NFL expert analysis that you need in less than 30 minutes after a very, very eventful 2022 opening weekend in the NFL, including some big-time homecomings that didn't necessarily work out the way that players anticipated. That's all for you on the Peacock and Williamson NFL show, which you can find wherever you get this podcast and on YouTube as well. As always, y'all, I appreciate you so much for making me a part of your day, part of your routine, saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, say hi. If you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints, make sure you're following along on Twitter at Ross Jackson, N-O-L-A. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation. I'll holla at you.